In this video, we're going to look at the Arranger track and the Marker track. Now, the Arranger track is an arrangement tool, and it lets you work with portions of your entire song and treat them like they were individual elements. And that way you can rearrange them quickly and move them around and copy them, delete them, etc. Now, the first thing is to define the sections, and then you can freely move them along the timeline, or you can insert them between other sections. You can cut, copy, paste, really control your whole arrangement from these markers if that's the way you want to work. Now, these actions are performed across all the tracks in your song that exist in the time area that each section covers. So this includes all events, parts, markers, tempo changes, automation. It'll treat everything together. So to start with, we get to this Arranger track from this button here, and it opens a new lane. And we can define a section in the Arranger track simply by using the Paint tool, or we can use the Command key, and that's Control on Windows, to temporarily toggle it, as we know. And then we can just define an area. Now, for example, I'm going to drag here for these first 4 bars, and it's called Intro. And that's one section of my song. I've been muting and moving things around a bit to get my arrangement in place. Now I'm going to define another area here. I'm going to hold Command to toggle the Paint tool for another 4 bars. And you'll notice that it's snapping, and that's based on my snap values that I have here. And of course, we can override that with the Shift key. So let me start by just playing back what we have. I've muted the guitar here and the drums in the first 4 bars. And let's listen. All right, so I want to rename these. I'm going to leave that as intro, but this one I want to rename. Now, there's a right-click menu, and I can color it with this palette over here. I'll change the color just for the sake of changing it. And then I can double-click the name, and that's what I'm going to call this section. Now, let's keep listening. All right, so there the guitar comes in. I think I'm going to move this piano solo about 4 bars later. And again, this is snapping. And I can do this with the markers, but I'm doing it for now. I want to create another section here, and I'll call this Guitar Enters. So again, I'm going to right-click and double-click. And then I'm going to change the color here. And then over here, I want to have a nice long piano solo. So let's do the same thing and name this. And then I'm going to create a guitar solo, and I have a track to import for that. And name that. And there I double-clicked by mistake, but it's actually a feature, and it zooms the view to show the section in full. I'll just zoom out a little bit, right-click, and then rename this. And then after that, maybe I'll add one last little section. And again, I'm just going to hold down the Command key and Control on Windows for 4 bars, and right-click and call it Reprise, and then maybe change the color so it's a little more different than the one before. So let's look at some of the things we can do with this. So what I can do is right-click, and I can delete the range. So for example, let's say I have Guitar Enters here. I can delete range, and it deletes the entire arrangement and shifts everything over. I'm going to hit Command-Z to undo. And the other thing I can do is simply cut the marker. And that will just remove the marker visually, but leave everything intact. And again, let me hit undo. And I can simply select it and just hit the backspace key, and that does the same thing. Now, when we do use these to actually shift the data around, there's 2 modes of operation, and it depends on the status of this time-based button. When it's in this musical icon mode right now, it means that the sections adhere to their bar and beat positions, not absolute time. So if there's tempo changes or whatever in the arrangement, when we delete these and things are shifted, it's going to maintain their relation to the bar and beat in the timeline. Now, when we click it and it turns into that clock icon, sections are going to adhere to their absolute time position. So in other words, whatever time they're at, not the bar and beat, that's what will be the reference point. And this is great if you're working with video and film and you want things to maintain their absolute time. This is the way to go, whereas the musical icon is great for bars and beats and musical sections like this. So let's look at some of the things we can do with this. Now, I can use the arrow tool to simply move a section. So for example, maybe I want this piano solo to happen over here. I just moved that whole section right over there, and it chopped all the events where necessary and moved all the data in that time range. I'm going to hit Command-Z to undo. Now I can hold down the Command and Alt key if I want to move that Arranger track section only without the underlying data, and that's Control-Alt on Windows. So with those two modifiers that I'm going to click and then press them, I can move the marker, and I've just moved the marker over, not the data. And again, I'm going to hit undo for the moment. Now I can insert things by clicking and dragging a section between two other sections. And then there's going to be a little line that appears between them. And when I let go of the mouse, it's going to insert it there and move all the sections to the right of the insertion point to make space for what I'm dragging. So let's say I decide this intro with drum section, I want it after guitar enters, which actually might work. I'm going to take this and drag it and position it right in there. And when I release it, it places it there. And then the piano solo comes after that. Let's just hear what that sounds like. Interesting. I don't think that's what I want, though. So I'm going to hit Command-Z and undo that. And if I click and drag an arrangement marker over another section and let go of the mouse, it'll delete the existing section and replace it with the new one. So maybe instead of this intro with drums, I want to just replace it with this guitar enters. I'm just going to release the mouse. Now that has replaced the intro with drums and it's gone. I've shortened my arrangement. So it's very useful. I'm going to hit undo for the moment. And I can click and drag a section over another longer section. And if I hold Shift, it'll replace just the portion of that section. So for example, intro with drums is only 4 bars and this is 8. So if I click and hold down Shift and drag this over here, it's just replaced part of it and then the rest of the piano solo remains. Again, I'm going to hit undo to revert. Now we can cut, copy, and paste either from the right-click menu or with Command-V, Command-X, and Command-C as we would expect. And we can create markers from these arranger sections, and we use the right-click menu. And the difference is that these arranger section markers have these sort of special properties where all the underlying data is controlled. But if we just want markers for visual reference, I can right-click, and I can go create markers from arranger sections. And now we have a new dedicated marker track in Studio 1.5. With this button here, I can get it, and you'll see that I now have markers for each of these. I'm just going to hide this marker track for a moment, and let's look at this. Now, another thing we can do is select all the events and parts across all the tracks within the bounds of one of the sections, and we just hold down Option and double-click. So, for example, I'm holding Option and double-click there. It's selected everything in that time range. And now it's done it for the intro with drums section. We can double-click and zoom to fit to view like I showed you earlier, and I'll just zoom back out a bit manually. And we can do more. Now, let's say this guitar enters section. I'm going to right-click on it. We can use this as the basis for creating or moving this to a scratch pad. Now, we haven't looked at scratch pads yet, but I can copy or move it. And let's say I'll copy it just to show you. And it opens up a new section of the arrange view. We're going to look at this in a separate video, but we can use these arrangement markers as the basis for scratch pad sections. So let me hit Command-Z and undo that. Now, there's an arranger track inspector view that accompanies this. You'll notice the inspector has changed. We can do a couple of things here. We can click to the left, and that'll locate the transport to the start of the section. You see, as I click here, it's moving the playback cursor. So it's great for moving around the timeline to musically relevant locations. Now, we can double-click here, and it'll locate and start playback. And of course, if it's already playing, just a single click will move it. Now we can drag from the list to the timeline to move a section. So let's say I'm going to take guitar events and just click that over here and drag it over here. It's moved it. So it's the same as moving it from here. I can just do it the same thing from here and hit undo. Now another thing I can do is use Option for that to copy it. So let's say I decide I want to put a copy of that guitar section at the end. I'm going to Option or Alt drag this over here. And now it's placed a copy there. And again, I'm going to undo. And we have a right-click menu as well with the same functions that we get when we right-click directly here in the Arrange Marker lane. Now let me close this, and I'm going to click in this new dedicated marker lane. And when I click in here, we get a dedicated marker inspector as well. So again, I can click here to locate the playback cursor and double-click to start playback. And there's a right-click menu here as well where I can set the color, double-click to rename it, stop at marker option. And I can convert these to arranger section markers, just like I can use the arranger section markers to convert to regular markers. So we can move back and forth. and I can cut, copy, paste, and I get the same right-click menu here. And we can use these plus and minus buttons to add markers or remove them, just as we can with the plus or minus buttons here, and we have the same bar beat, time-based reference versus absolute reference here. So if you want to use these mainly for navigation and visually identifying the sections of your song, you're better off using regular markers, whereas the Arranger track is better if you want to use this to actually rearrange your music. We'll continue with more in the next video.